Hi everyone, Evis T here. I just got back from seeing Star Trek Into Darkness, and I thought I'd share my views and opinions with anyone who's seen it or might be considering seeing it. This will be spoiler free. Well, not spoiler free, but I will separate the spoilers out and give you a nice big clear warning before they're going to come, so don't complain to me if you heard something that ruined the film for you. Where to begin? I think in order for you to grasp my thoughts on this, we need to understand where I'm coming from. Alright, I grew up on TNG, and I really loved TNG as a kid. Loved it all the way through up until nearly finished secondary school even. At that point though, my attention started to get distracted by other things. I got a lot more into video games, a lot more into fantasy, a lot more into anime actually, which I've not really kept up with. But it kind of fell by the wayside a bit. And it's a shame, because I did enjoy it. I actually read the Star Trek encyclopedia literally from back to back, cover to cover. I was a very, very, very big nerd. But I liked it, but I kind of drifted away from it. Deep Space Nine brought me back a little bit. I'm probably one of the few people who grew up on TNG and enjoyed it, and actually also really liked Deep Space Nine as well. But, you know, that gives you a sort of idea as to what I was moving for. I didn't quite like what Trek was, but I kind of liked what it turned into with Deep Space Nine. One thing I never liked, though, is the Trek movies, with the exception of First Contact. The original series movies, fine. I've not seen them recently, but I don't remember them being particularly bad. I remember being bored shitless by the first one, but it had neat ideas in it. The second one, Wrath of Khan, I think is an absolutely phenomenal movie. I think it's the best of the entire bunch. Without a shadow of a doubt, actually, it's the best of the entire bunch for me. You may have a different opinion, but for me, Wrath of Khan is the best. But your opinion is wrong, because Wrath of Khan is the best. The rest, they're there. Good, bad, meh. Then the TNG movies happened. Generations, I thought, was bad. It was like they had the same people who were writing episodes now writing a film, but they couldn't figure out how to write a film, so they just wrote a really long episode. I don't know if it was the same writers. I honestly don't know, but that's what it felt like. What came after Generations? Was it First Contact after Generations? Oh, I can't remember. Either way, First Contact was good. Generations I didn't like. Insurrection I thought was an egregious... Yeah, it was Insurrection next, wasn't it, I think? Either way, it was... No, that one was afterwards. I got the order mixed up, but Insurrection was a pile of shit. I think it's actually a really, really bad film. Not just a bad Trek movie, just a bad film all around. Nemesis was just... Certain films have a feel to them. You can't quantify exactly where it comes from, but you watch it and you just get a feeling from it. And with Nemesis, the feeling I got was, we're all tired, we're all fed up of this, and we're just going through the motions. There was no passion in that film. It was just everyone shuffling through, doing what they needed to do to get their paycheck. And I didn't like it. But Nemesis, Insurrection, First Contact, Generations... I'm sure I'm missing one. But either way, the only one I actually liked was First Contact. And I think the key problem with all of these films was that they wanted to be like TNG, but at the same time they wanted to appeal to a mass audience. So they wanted to have that sort of slow burn, and they wanted to have all that science-y stuff in there, but at the same time they didn't want to keep the movies inaccessible. So what you ended up with was this sort of hideous chimera, this horrible abomination whereby you had these characters who were acting like Hollywood movie characters as opposed to the characters they were on the show. I just look at the way that Picard behaves in the films compared to the way that he behaves in the show. On the show, he's calm, cool, collected, rational, always trying to figure out the most peaceful solution to benefit all parties. And then he just starts shooting shit up. And in Insurrection, the crisis he faces in Insurrection is in the TNG series. he has to forcibly relocate a group of American Indians. And he does it. And, you can argue it, oh, well, maybe he's just learned that that's wrong or something this time, but that's not really brought up. So they're very different. And I think that's what made them poor. They were trying to please everyone and just didn't end up hitting the marks. I know that canonically it's always the odd-numbered ones that are the bad ones, but to be honest, I just think most of them were bad. And that's the reason I like First Contact, is it didn't try to pretend to be anything other than a big, dumb action movie. And I think when you have a clear vision in your mind as to what the film is going to be, and everyone who is creating that film knows what that vision is and is working towards it, you get I swore I would never use this word, you get a synergy. Oh, a little piece of me just died. Hang on, I'm going to fill that little piece of me that just died. Anyway, yeah. And I think that came through in First Contact. The characters behaved like action hero characters, but there was none of that pretense as to really who they were before. And whilst it's very, very not Star Trek as well, Star Trek was always supposed to be about peaceful solutions wherever possible, and this utopian future, and everyone working together, and it was a very positive and empowering message for the human condition. First Contact, let's face it, isn't. They just run around shooting people and killing people and assimilating people and blowing stuff up and shooting and more shooting and gunfire, but it works. I mean, seriously, it works. It's a pretty entertaining film because it's not trying to be anything else. Which brings me to Star Trek IX. Star Trek IX did exactly the same thing. They just went, right, fuck it. We're not even going to try and pretend that this is scientifically accurate, or pretend that this is anything more than just action, shooting, explosions, well made. We want people to care about the characters, we want people to be invested in the story, we want an emotional bond, but at the end of the day, we're just making an action movie set in space using some pre-established characters that we're going to reinvent slightly. And I think it worked. I actually really enjoyed Star Trek IX. It is one of my favourite Star Trek movies because of the fact that it knew exactly what it wanted to be, and it just worked towards that goal. So, when I saw the trailer for Into Darkness, I got really, really worried because it looked like they'd given up on trying to maintain any sort of connection to the original Star Trek. So the other thing that IX did well is it referenced and honoured the source material. It wasn't afraid to change it in order to make it its own project, and that's a good thing, but it didn't just change stuff because it could. It didn't just change stuff because they couldn't really be asked. It was all to do with creating their own project, but at the same time trying to be not true to the original, but respectful to it. And you can be respectful to the original adapted material without necessarily being true to it. There was lots of little references, ranging from the obvious, such as the brain slugs, to the subtle, like the eye lighting, and the whispering of Uhura's first name, because not many people actually know Uhura's first name if they just watch the show. But there was a respect to the original. They weren't trying to copy it, and they were going to make their own thing, but that didn't mean that they needed to just stick a middle finger up at the original, and they didn't. The trailer for 10, it looked like they had. It was just like lots of people running on the ground, the only shots of the ship were the ship crashing, it didn't look like there was going to be much going on in space. It didn't look like they were going to go visiting exotic places, or we could see weird and wonderful things, no sense of exploration or venturing into the unknown, which are other things I think that the Trek series, the tonal hallmarks of the Trek series. But there was a reason for that. And the reason for that is because the thing that makes Star Trek Into Darkness a Trek film, you can't put in the trailer because it would actually give the game away. and we'll get onto that in the spoilers section. But for now, the important thing is that they've changed the way that they honour the source material. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of that, a quick overview of the film for those of you who are actually considering going to see it or just want a review. The acting is still pretty solid. I don't think anyone can fault the acting in Star Trek IX. You can certainly fault the plot in many ways and the science behind it, but the actual delivery of the lines, I think, was pretty damn good. Zachary Quinto as Spock has just fucking well nailed it. Chris Pine's Kirk, I think, is very, very different, but I do still like him. And the characters are developing as well. One of the threads that runs through this film is the idea of bringing these younger characters more in line with the older characters. So, the Kirk kind of has to rein himself in a bit. He can't just go firing off the handle and breaking all the rules and being the rogue. He kind of learns that, that there's consequences to this, and these rules exist for a reason, and he needs to rein it in a bit. So, in theory, this was bringing him closer to the Kirk that we know from the original series, who wasn't afraid to break the rules, who took dangerous risks, who gambled all or nothing, who'd go all in on a pair of sixes. But at the same time, he didn't just go straight in for those things. He'd always be very intelligent and precise. He'd jump the gun a little bit, he'd rush things, he'd be headstrong, but he wasn't impulsive in the same way that Chris Pine's Kirk is impulsive. He was the impulsiveness of a man who knew he was damn good at what he did, rather than the impulsiveness of someone who's just young. So the characters are maturing. Spock, in turn, also matures, and basically he discovers that he needs to learn more about emotions and how he deals with emotions and how other people's emotions affect him and how he affects them. At first I thought they were just kind of writing Spock badly, because it's like, at the end of the day, he's not an idiot, alright? Not having emotions in the same way that a human being doesn't make him stupid. He understands emotions, he gets the effect they have on people, even if he doesn't feel them entirely in the same way. Now, Trekkie fans are, of course, going to be well aware that Vulcans do have emotions. In fact, they have very passionate and fiery emotions. They just repress them. So even then, they understand these things, but Spock was just kind of like, I don't get why you acted in such a weird and peculiar way. Well, it's obvious, you fucking moron. But you kind of got to remember, and this is really hard with Zachary Quinto, that character is not Spock from the original series. It is a much younger Spock, a Spock who probably hasn't quite learned all these things yet. Because even though, as I said, the Vulcans have emotions, their culture makes it very, very different. So the effect that emotions have on the decisions being taken by adults, and people in positions of power no less, are going to be very different to them. So it makes sense. And when I realised that and accepted it, I had quite a lot of fun with that performance, because it isn't that Spock's stupid, it's just that he's not yet matured into that character that we know. So there's some actual arcs there. Uhura is still somewhat sidelined. Carl Urban's McCoy is Carl Urban's McCoy. Simon Pegg as Scotty gets a lot more screen time. He's comedic relief, but let's face it, he was always comedic relief. Well, not necessarily Scotty, but Simon Pegg in Star Trek IX, he was comedic relief as well there, so what do you expect? He has a bit more to do with the actual plot, though. He's not just there to go, ooh, and can he? That wasn't Scottish. What the hell was that? Anyway, he's kind of just there for well, he's not just there for comic relief. It's what he does, but he also actually has a role within the plot. He works things out. He pieces things together. His actions have an impact on the other characters and the directions that they take over the course of the movie. So he's a bit more of a main character. Well, he's closer to a main character, shall we say. So, if you liked Simon Pegg Scotty, there's a lot more of him in this film. Now, the villain. Oh boy. I've seen this guy in a few things and I can never remember his bloody name. But he plays this villain really well. He does menacing, down to a T. I love it. He was really entertaining to watch. But we'll get more into that once we hit the spoilers card, because damn. Okay, the writing is a lot stronger than Star Trek 9, but it is still a bit flimsy. I think anything with Damon Lindelof's name on it is going to get flimsy. The question is, can the other producers and writers actually save him from damaging it too much? I don't like his writing. He might be a perfectly nice guy. I'm not saying anything about him. I just think his body of work is questionable at best. Prometheus being a fine example of that. But it's more robust. You don't have things right in front of your face that's just like, hey, what? It's more, you can nitpick this, you can nitpick anything, but you don't need to work very hard to nitpick this film. If you think about what you're being shown and told in certain areas for more than a couple of seconds, you see the man behind the curtain. So the narrative and writing isn't as strong as I would like it to be, but at the same time, it's still much stronger than 9 was, and I think it's strong enough to actually lose stray hair. It's strong enough to actually hold up. Like I say though, if you think about it too much, things are going to fall apart. Like there's one, as an example, there's a bit at the very start of the film, so I'm not giving away too much here. One of the characters is in great peril and they need to rescue him. And there's a countdown on the view screen. And the thing is, what the hell is it counting down to? Because it is counting down to the death of this character, but there's no earthly way that the Enterprise knows how long this person has, and they do in fact establish that they don't know what's going on and how long this person has. So what's that timer? What's it counting down to? It's little things like that that are present throughout the film and will take you out of it if you think too much about it. So take that for what it's worth. It's stronger than 9, but if you're the sort of person who is constantly analysing everything and trying to make the connections and jumping one step further than the filmmakers want you to go, it's gonna break the trick for you at least a few times in the film. That said, when it's good, it's really good. And one thing that the film does exceptionally well are the character moments and the character set pieces and the big emotions. This film has huge emotions. Humongous emotions. Rage, pain, terror, savagery. People getting their heads popped like melons. It does it really well. You can't help but get sucked into these scenes, and some of it is really grandiose and melodramatic, but by God does it work. It just works. These guys pull it off beautifully. So, again, you've got to take the good with the bad. You've got these big, beautiful emotions, but you do have issues with the narrative if you think too hard. So, again, take that for what it's worth. Visually, I think it was quite good. The lens flare is a problem now. In the first film, it was just, the lens flare was a quirk. It was a funny little, why is that there? What's with the lens flare? Dear God, but here it's just, there is so much lens flare that it's now actually, I didn't even notice the lens flare in the first one, to be honest, but here, by God, was it annoying. And it was one scene where a character is trying to do one of these big emotion moments, and you can't see the actor's face because of this fucking great big lens flare flashing out from behind them. It's like, what? You've got this person trying to give a performance, for fuck's sakes, pull your head out of your arse. This isn't style. This isn't your own personal individual thing. This is just an insult to that actor and that performance. But, again, apart from the lens flares, which are obviously an issue for some people, including me, the rest of it was really nice. I mean, it again boils down to whether or not you liked the redesigns in the first reboot. The Budweiser Brewery engineering section is still there. The warp core has now been changed around a little bit. It actually now looks like the National Ignition Facility. But later on in the film, when they go inside that shielding outer level, if you will. The warp core, it's still different, but it more closely resembles what people expect. So maybe that will satisfy some of the nitpicking, oh my god, Dr. Manhattan was the wrong shade of blue, this film is worse than Hitler crowd. Sorry, I have absolutely no time or patience for people like that. I know people who don't like the Star Trek reboot, and they have very good reasons for not liking it, reasons that I can respect, but simply going, oh, they changed the engineering section, no, it just looks like a cruise liner now. Fuck off, you pathetic little wretches. If you don't like what the redesign was, like you don't like the new design, that's fine, I can get right behind that. But just whining just because they've changed it, I don't get it. I mean, changing it to something that's bad, fine. Just whining for just because they changed it, well, you're missing the point. Anyway, going off on a tangent here. Yeah, the redesigned warp core looked pretty cool, because as I say, it reminded me of the National Ignition Facility, which is a prototype real fusion reactor. We do actually have fusion reactors. I believe the most efficient one at the moment is in South Korea. I think it's called the K-Star. But it still takes more energy to get the thing going than you get out of it. So they're still not viable, which is why we haven't yet cracked fusion. But we do actually have, well, we could say fusion reactors. We are capable of producing fusion reactions in a laboratory, I think would be a more accurate thing to say. Again, I'm going off on another tangent again, I apologise. But yeah, the engineering sections and so forth reused, but with a few extra bits as well. So if you really hated that design, I'm sorry, but it's still there. We see more ships, more Federation ships and more other ships. I'm not going to tell you what these ships are until the spoilers section, because I don't want to give the surprise away. But it's redesigns of some iconic stuff, and I do really like the look of them. So, there's some little bait hint there. So we've been over the acting, we've been over the narrative, we've been over the visuals. The musical score, it gets a little bit comedic at times, because, like I say, this film is all about big emotions, and the musical score reflects that. And you'll have these certain characters coming onto screen will get this big greeting. Leonard Nimoy makes another appearance, and when you see him, it does it. It's just kind of like, I want to call this a really, really cheap way of giving the audience an emotional kick, but you know what? Whenever Leonard Nimoy appears, he deserves that fanfare. So the soundtrack, what I'm saying is, could get a little intrusive. I think the best sound and the best music is typically the stuff you don't notice, the stuff that works away at the back of your brain, kicking certain emotional levers without you ever actually knowing that it's done it. I think that when you notice the soundtrack and you notice the music, it doesn't necessarily take anything away from the movie, because if it's well composed, you could get the pleasure of a nice piece of music. But I don't think that the role of music in film is to be beautiful music. It's to aid in invoking certain emotions and responses from the audience, rather than it is to just be beautiful. But it can be both. And again, that's just my opinion, that's just my take on the medium, so, please don't skewer me. So, final conclusions. Hang on, has this thing gone blurry? There we go. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to have done that or if it was just some other focusing thing, but it's just gone blurry, I apologise. Final takes. Well, I really enjoyed this film. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is my favourite Trek movie. Now, it's not the best Trek movie. The best Trek movie is Wrath of Khan. It is not, however, the most entertaining film. I think Wrath of Khan was a very cerebral film, but also had its great share of action. It had great characters, but it also had a great plot and narrative. I think all around it was just a beautifully constructed, beautifully made film, and it deserves all the praise it gets. Star Trek Into Darkness is not as big, and it's not as clever, but it's still very well made, and the big emotions just sucked me into the film, and I loved every minute of it. It's so wonderfully self-indulgent, yet at the same time almost self-deprecating. It's taking itself really seriously, but the way that they play, the way they reference the original material now has become that they will construct certain scenes, interactions and things in such a way as to mirror iconic images from past Trek material. And not just images, certain conversations, certain ideas, certain concepts, certain characters will all be mirrored. It's like a new take. It's like what the Battlestar Galactica reimagining did with the original Battlestar Galactica. This is doing with Trek. But it's not doing it with the core concept. It's doing it with specific elements of the lore. So it's no longer just, hey, check out the mind control slug. Or, hey, we have eye lighting. Or, hey, look, Dr. McCoy said, I'm a doctor, not a insert whatever here. It's now a lot more subtle. But because it's so much more subtle, it's almost beautiful how they work these things in. So it gave me a lot of pleasure to see that care and attention that someone was putting to creating their own project, whilst at the same time having such a respect for the original as to be able to weave it into their own material and make it their own without it being a middle finger to the original. Because oftentimes if you're remaking something someone else has done, it's so easy if you're changing it to basically come across as, oh yeah, we can do it better. That's not what I got from Star Trek Into Darkness. What I got from Star Trek Into Darkness was a team of people who knew the source material and had the utmost respect for it and wanted to use it, but at the same time were not afraid to make their own project, and they hit that beautiful balance of being able to use the original source material and reference the original source material without demeaning it, and whilst also adapting it. So that to me I think made this film great. But it is also what will kill the film for many of you. Because the material they are referencing is beloved. They're not referencing minutiae and little things here. They're not just sticking a tribble down here and there anymore. They're now lifting things, images, ideas that Trek fans love and changing them. And this is where this film will either make you or break you. If you don't mind the idea of source material being changed, I think you'll have a lot of fun with this because they change it in very inventive and creative ways. On the other hand, if you're one of the Dr. Manhattan, they got something wrong crowd, you will despise this film. In fact, you will hate this film more than Star Trek IX, I guarantee it, because they are now taking very big risks in trusting that a fan base is going to be mature enough to realise that what they're doing isn't sticking two fingers up at the original, but celebrating the original while creating their own project. If you can get that into your head, you'll have a good time. But if you're the sort of person who just bitches and moans about things being changed, they are changing some things that you love. Spare yourself the aneurysm. Don't see it, because you'll only hate it. In fact, you'll probably buy it when it comes out on DVD so you can make videos about how much you hate it. You'll watch it about 7 or 8 times just so you can pick up every little detail and figure out how to hate it. On the other hand, if you like the first one, this is more of the same, but even better made. If you didn't like the first one on the basis that you didn't think it was a very good movie, but you didn't mind it from a Trek fan perspective, then this might win you over, because this is a much better made film. The narrative is better done, the actors have settled into their roles, the director's got a much better idea of where he's going and what he wants to do. It's just generally all around a better made film. So that might win you over. So depending on which of those 3 camps you fall into is my recommendation. If you like the original, you'll probably like this. If you didn't like the original, but you didn't like it because you thought it was a poorly made film, then you might like this one. If you didn't like the original, or should I say by the original I mean Star Trek IX, because they changed stuff, this will kill you. If you didn't like the changes that they made, that didn't mind the fact that changes exist, again, this might win you over because the way that they approach these changes has changed. It's no longer just that there's now the original is now far more woven into the actual fabric of the film instead of just being a reference dotted here and there. Transitioning to spoilers. Spoilers. Stop now. Stop now. Spoilers beyond this point. Star Trek Into Darkness. Mostly the second half, well, the last third, is almost a remake of Wrath of Khan. Now, it's not. A remake of Wrath of Khan is putting it a little bit too far, because there's no Mutara Nebula, there's no big spaceship battle. In fact, the Enterprise basically just gets its arse handed to it. But the main villain is Khan. Yeah. And it works. Now this Khan is of course a bit different. It's a much younger Khan. And you've got to remember this film is made for a mass audience, not just Trekkies. Now, Khan's superior intellect does certainly come into play, but they also make sure to firmly establish that he is also just a badass. So, he does the whole badass things that Hollywood badasses do in order to demonstrate that they are badass. If you can get past that, and the fact that the intellect plays out in the background more than it does with his planning and so forth, it's a really good take on Khan. And they play up the idea of him not necessarily being a noble savage, but a articulate and intelligent, but utterly ruthless and quite possibly deranged professional killer, essentially. His backstory is the same. They don't really go into the eugenics wars, but they hint at it. It's basically he's been in cryosleep for 300 years. A Starfleet admiral cracks him open, wanting to use his savagery and his intellect to basically design new weapons for Starfleet in a bureau called Section 31. Ha 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 ha. Of course, he eventually goes rogue, and Kirk is sent to bring him in. The reason I say it's so much like Wrath of Khan is because there are certain very key scenes that are in there, and I will give you one spoiler, but I won't completely spoil it for you. The death scene, from towards the end of Wrath of Khan, is in there. But it's not done the same way. I think the original was better. But the only reason I think the original is better is because I absolutely love Wrath of Khan and wish that I could sleep with it. This take on it, though, is still really good. And yes, Khan's name is shouted really loudly. But not by Kirk. So, that is the big reveal, essentially, is the villain is Khan. And a lot of the key points that the plot is turning around is that the villain is Khan, and that they're pulling stuff out of Wrath of Khan as reference and essentially basis of the story. I keep saying that it's references, but in Into Darkness, it's not references anymore. They're adapting sections of the plot more than they are referencing minutiae from the original. And it just works. The film starts really rocky. It starts basically almost like an Indiana Jones film, and this basically compounded my problem going into this, thinking that, oh god, this isn't going to be a Trek movie because it's they've pissed all over the Prime Directive, and oh no, it looks like Kirk was ordered to piss all over the Prime Directive, because they're doing the whole, yes, we're going to save this planet of primitive people from exploding, and the thing is, the Federation actually doesn't really do that. If they're pre-warp civilizations and there's something that's going to wipe them out, the Federation will let them die. And this is something that has been approached in the TNG series before. So I was kind of thinking, yeah, that's a pretty big thing to ditch out there, guys. But I don't want to be one of the Dr. Manhattan's the wrong shade of blue crowds. So I thought, I'll let this slide. They're doing their own thing. Maybe they'll do something interesting with it. Maybe it'll be really worth it. So I let it play out, and sure enough, a bit further in the film, it turns out all Kirk was supposed to be doing was surveying the planet. He wasn't actually supposed to be saving them, and was actually bollocked for doing so. So I was like, right, okay, so that's like one of the core things of the original series, that they've actually preserved it. Okay, that's fine. We'll see where this goes. And this basically starts Kirk's arc, because he gets the Enterprise taken away from him for being so reckless and for not following the rules. And of course, by the end of it, he needs to learn why these rules are there and why they should exist. Spock as well is saved by Kirk at great risk, because Kirk reveals the Enterprise to the Primitives in order to have to save Spock. And of course, there's violating the Prime Directive, and then there's just utterly destroying it, which is does. There's then a attack by the terrorist, who is like a rogue Starfleet agent, who is in fact Khan. And all Starfleet captains are gathered together in order to discuss this, and boom daka daka daka, boom daka daka daka, he attacks them. And they then discover that essentially after the attack he's hiding out on Kronos. Yep, the Klingon homeworld. He's hiding in a area of the Klingon homeworld that's uninhabited, and Kirk is basically sent to get him back. And yeah, they do a lot of things building up tensions with the Klingons and how risky this mission is and so forth. So I'm skipping over the fine detail, but explanations are put in. Some of them, admittedly, are quite flimsy, but the writers are at least trying to address the questions that a Trek fan is going to ask, and trying to offer some sort of answer, or at the very least something to hang disbelief on. So we've got that. They head into Kronos, and we see Klingons. This film has Klingons in it, and yes, Klingons have been redesigned again. In all fairness, they're not hugely redesigned. They look very similar to the Klingons that we have at the moment in the original Star Trek, but the forehead ridges and things are a lot cleaner. They have a little bit more in the way of piercings and scarrings, and then the helmets they wear look exactly like Uruk-hai helmets, which I found quite funny. There's like Orc Uruk-hai, not Orc, Klingon Uruk-hai. The ships have been redesigned as well. The Bird of Prey now looks it looks more like a sort of gunship, but like halfway between, say, an Osprey and the old standard D7. Was it D7 or D9? The old standard Klingon battle cruisers, the Vorcha battle cruisers, and so they've got these like multi-variable wings on them, and I'm not sure if they're the actual space ones or if it's just atmospheric, but it's a nice, interesting take on it. It keeps it in tone and visual style with the rest of the film, but obviously being Klingon, it looks nowhere near as clean or as nice as the Enterprise does. And I'd love to get an inside look at one of those ships and just see if what they've done to like mitigate the whole iPod look of the Starship Enterprise in this one. Anyway, Uhura tries to talk her way out of it. This goes about as well as Uhura ever trying to talk her way out of Klingon has gone. And there's a big action scene where Khan basically shows up and saves them, and this is where he does the whole action hero thing. He's basically just standing there with his fucking great big anti-aircraft gun in one hand and a phaser rifle with another, and basically he's just shooting down birds of prey and blasting away at these Klingon patrols, and then when they get too close he swings around and belts somewhere over the head with this anti-aircraft gun. And it's just shamelessly indulgent action sequences, but by God, it works. It just really does work. But it just establishes Khan as an ass kicker. But there's a very, very clever scene, and this is where I started to suspect that this guy was actually Khan. Kirk arrests him, but then obviously Kirk, being pissed off about the fact that he's bombed a building and killed a load of people that he's never known, tries to lay into him and do the whole Kirk thing. And he basically wails on this guy, really trying to lay into him. And Khan's just, ow. What do you do that for? I needed those. You're annoying me now. And that's when you kind of realise, yeah, this guy ain't quite right. He is more than just a secret agent. And they pack him off onto the Enterprise. Well, they can't get to... The Enterprise has a warp core malfunction. Going back to an earlier plot point, they give the Enterprise these special stealth photon torpedoes that they can fire at long range onto Kronos. And the idea is that they're going to just basically nuke the guy from nuke him from orbit. The only way to be sure. But Spock kind of persuades Kirk that, well, you know, these rules exist for a reason, and at the end of the day, Starfleet regulations say, even if he is this mad bomber, he's entitled to a trial. He can't just be killed. If he is killed, it has to be killed by the justice system, not on a vendetta, which is, I think, a very bold and important lesson, given the general prevalence and attitude to that people have these days towards those who have wronged them. And essentially, Kirk in the end agrees and tries to take him alive. So they get back to the Enterprise after having taken a shuttle that they impounded from some poor sod somewhere, and this new starship turns up to take Khan back, and it's this fucking new Dreadnought class, big, overgunned monstrosity, pure warship. Fans of Trek will of course know that the Federation ships are not military ships. They are very well armed. In fact, they are about as well armed as military ships of the other major powers in the Alpha Quadrant. But their purpose and their function is not military combat. They have a very good science suites, plenty of cargo space. The Federation basically builds its ships to do anything, including be military ships. But building an actual warship is something they generally don't do. I mean, the Defiant was quite a big thing. So this thing turns up, and it basically just wipes the floor with the Enterprise. They try to jump to warp, but the thing catches up to them in warp and then blows the shit out of them. And the fight scene while they're in warp is really cool. From there, this is where the film basically starts to transition a bit more into Wrath of Khan, as Kirk is basically required to strike a deal with Khan in order to save his ship and his crew, and he starts, at this point, learning a little bit more about responsibility and the rules and so on. And this is the point where I really don't want to talk too much, because this is the point where you start to notice how they're weaving a lot of the Wrath of Khan ideas and imagery and scenes into the film. And I think seeing those and spotting them will give you a hell of a lot more fun. So even though I'm in the spoiler section, I'm not going to talk too much more about the actual end of the film. Suffice to say, it was good. It was very, very well done. I think that the ideas that they took and the ways that they changed the source material to fit with their own project were beautifully executed. So I'm going to bring this little ramble to a close. The end take-home message, if you will, is that this is a really good, really well-made movie. I think it's a lot better than Star Trek IX. I think it's hugely entertaining. And I've already described who will like this movie and who won't like this movie. But my personal recommendation is go and see it. But for now, I'm Evis T, signing off.